In this video, Dr. Jordan Peterson explains why some people get phobia regardless of context and ways to help them cure it.
So that's the basic structure, and we've talked about that at length, and I suggested that while you're occupying a structure like that, the world manifests itself to you not as objects, but as, number one, things to ignore, which is the major category. I was talking to some guy yesterday who is working, I think he was in San Diego, on artificial intelligence and neural networks, and he was working with someone who's actually started to, so a neural network will learn how to weight certain stimulus features, let's say, in order to identify an image. So the thing will be trained up on a whole set of diverse images, and it learns through feedback to discriminate between them. But the problem with the neural network is that it's not easy to understand what's actually going on inside of them, because it's self-generated. So we could easily end up, for example, creating fully conscious machines and not understanding at all how they work. That's the most likely outcome in my estimation. But this guy was working with another guy who had figured out how to model the weights, and one of the things he told me was that a tremendous amount of what the neural network is doing is learning what's not relevant, right? Which is exactly what, and these, by the way, these neural network models produce output that's analogous to the output that's produced by sections of cortical tissue. It's not identical, but so partly they make the same kind of mistakes, which is an indication that they're functioning in the same way. So one of the things that a neural net does when you're training it is learn to figure out which things it can ignore, and that's mostly what you're doing, is what can be ignored. And that's a tremendous realization too, because it highlights again how important the structure within which you exist, how importantly the structure within which you exist determines what manifests itself to you as you move through the world, because you ignore almost everything. So you ignore almost everything, but then you concentrate on things that move you along your way, or obstacles that get in your way. And those things have emotional significance. They're valenced, and the reason they're valenced is because they're conceptualized in relationship to the journey. You know, if you run across a tool or something positive, an opportunity, we could say, which is like an abstract tool, then that moves you forward. And the fact that it's moving you forward is signaled by the incentive reward system, dopaminergically mediated incentive reward system, that's grounded in the hypothalamus, the same system that you use when you explore, the same system that's activated by psychomotor stimulants like cocaine and heroin and most of the drugs that people abuse. That system indicates to you that this entity is non-ignorable because it's positively, functionally related to the transformation of the world that you're attempting to accomplish. So that makes you happy. It makes you, that provides you with hope and incentive to move forward. A fundamental motivating force of life for human beings, with the possible exception, say, of aggression and sexuality, which I would say operate much more sporadically. This is pretty much continual. And then, of course, the negative emotions are generated when you encounter something that gets in the way, which can require a small detour, let's say, or can blow apart the frame that you're inhabiting completely. And part of what we're trying to do is understand how you compute how emotional to get about certain classes of events. And the reason that it's so complicated is because often when you run into a tool or an opportunity, generally speaking, it's not too hard to compute how useful it is. Although sometimes something can happen to you, like let's say you win a lottery, where the possibility space is so great that it's of indefinite positive significance, you know, and you're going to be overwhelmed by that sort of thing. It's pretty rare that something like that happens. It does happen to people. Maybe it happens when someone that you're desperately chasing for amorous purposes agrees to go out with you. That's another place where that sort of excitement occurs. It seems to occur to football players, you know, when they make a touchdown on TV too, because they do their little touchdown and dance around like mad dogs. And, you know, scientists never do that when they get a paper published. So there's something about scoring a goal that's really got that incentive reward blast, you know. So anyhow, the positive emotion systems are operating, roughly speaking, because you have encountered something that moves you forward on your path. And we could say that given, as we've discussed, that your value structure is a nested entity, right, with small goals nested inside larger goals, or small personalities nested inside of larger personalities, a positive thing that's really positive has implications for what you're doing right now that are positive, but also has positive implications higher up the abstraction chain. You know, so for example, let's say you study really hard for an exam and you get a really good grade on it, and you're surprised. You think, well, that's extraordinarily useful. I passed the grade, I passed the exam, I did well in the course, but that means that maybe I'm a better student than I thought, and given what I'm aiming for in the future, maybe I'm a more competent person than I had believed. And so you can see that the positive emotion would echo through those levels of analysis because it has implications on each level. Now, you're also trying, when you encounter something negative, to constrain its propagation across those levels, because let's say you study really hard and you fail dismally, and so then you think, well, I messed up this course, I messed up this exam, I messed up this course, I'm not as good a student as I think I am, maybe I'm a failure as a person, and that can take you out completely, right? And of course there are certainly more traumatic events that can befall you than that. A typical one that really will wipe someone out, imagine someone who's naive and dependent and over-sheltered, you know, and so they're off into the world, although they're not prepared for it, and you know, their axiomatic presuppositions aren't sophisticated enough to allow for the existence of radical uncertainty or malevolence, and then one day they're attacked when maybe they're out, they get mugged, or maybe they get raped or something worse, and they develop post-traumatic stress disorder from that. And the reason for that is that the event is so anomalous, especially combined with its malevolence, that it demolishes the interpretation frames from the local level all the way out to the superordinate level, and then the person is cast into this chaotic state, and they're terrified and angry and vengeful and paralyzed and depressed and all of those things simultaneously, and maybe they never put the pieces back together, right? They descend into chaos, and that's that. And if you're in a situation like that long enough, you know, the cortisol that's produced can produce permanent neurophysiological changes, shrinkage of the hippocampus, which is the part of the brain that moves information from short-term attention to long-term storage, shrinkage of the hippocampus, and growth of the amygdala, which is something that seems to tag stimuli, roughly speaking, with emotional significance more or less permanently, right? Because if you really encounter something traumatic, the hippocampus restricts information with regards to its application in a certain time and place, so it's sort of situation specific. But if you encounter something truly dangerous, your brain is set up so that you will be afraid of it regardless of context. So the amygdala can produce context-independent fears, and those are basically, well, they can be part of post-traumatic stress disorder, they can be part of a very, very serious phobia. And so you can't contextualize them. What you really do with someone who has a problem like that is you try to walk them through a recontextualization process. So, you know, maybe if they're afraid of snakes, so afraid of them they can't even really think of snakes, you have them, well, first maybe you have them sit for 1 second and think of a cartoon snake, you know, and what happens is their brain notices that they can hold that image and nothing negative happens. And so then in some sense it's built an inhibitory structure that partially inhibits, which is what inhibitory structures do, that partially inhibits the otherwise context-independent fear that would constitute the phobia. And so you basically build up contexts of safety around the phobia until the context signifies lack of danger and the person can progress forward. If they're really damaged, it's really hard to do that, especially if the trauma was really severe.